It's an absolute honor for me to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Dave Carless. Dave is with Influential Drones. He created it. They're out of Philadelphia and highly involved as an FAA drone pro. He is the industry lead and also very involved in NIST standards and including law enforcement and counter-UAS training. So without further ado, over to Dave. Thanks for coming, bud.
Appreciate you.
Woo-hoo.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Dave Krause. As mentioned, I am one of the industry members with the FAA safety team. I created a company called Influential Drones, and basically we go around and promoting a safety culture for the national airspace. But this council and this group is not about me. It's about these expert witnesses and people on this panel. So let's talk about the introduction of each one of them, and then we'll circle back.
Okay, I just want to make one quick comment. That last panel, I read it as show me the money working for the federal government. And it was like, wait a minute, I don't have any money. But then, you know, words matter. It's with the federal government. So glad to clear it up. So my name is Mary Rupert. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security, specifically the Counter-UAS Program Management Office under the Office of Policy, everybody's favorite policy. I started my career after the attacks of September 11th. So my entire career has been because of September 11th. So I just graduated from college, didn't have a job yet. 9/11 happened, and working for the Department of Homeland Security seemed like a very appealing, patriotic thing to do. So that's what I did. I started at Pittsburgh International Airport. That's where I got my foot in the door with the TSA. And then I worked my way down here to DC. I've worked in an operations center under the Federal Air Marshal Service for roughly the last 13 years doing real-time incident management, transportation security incident management. And then in the last year, I've been with the Office of Policy under DHS.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Adams. Your story is interesting too because I submitted my application to the FBI on July of 2001. They weren't hiring, and I got a call in October 2001 and started that process. But spent 20 years in federal law enforcement. 11 of those years I spent as a special agent bomb technician, and the last 3 years I spent as a counter-UAS program manager with the FBI, and then just retired in October, and currently CEO of a counter-UAS training and consulting company, and then we also run a counter-UAS informational website called CUAS Hub.
Jonathan Ruprecht. I'm an aviation attorney. Background as a commercial pilot flight instructor. I've been involved in all sorts of litigation, race day quads, Taylor, Singer case. Also doing counter-UAS defense right now and, on the defense side, and that's kind of what I do.
Lori DeMatteis, a lot of you know me in the industry. Started about 3.5 years ago here. But my whole background includes both the communications layer, the software and the hardware layer. And I've been in tech, I won't tell you how many years, but always about growing companies, growing business, and taking care of clients all over the world.
So I've actually been in the software industry for about 25 years. I used to be a software architect for IBM. For me, a drone or anything mobile robotics is just a moving computer. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with the group here, and hadn't realized the motivation for a lot of them being September 11th. That was actually my motivating factor for leaving IBM. So I really want to talk about what's going on. Careless, clueless, and criminal. How to secure critical assets and things that could potentially be of threat for us in the national airspace. Philadelphia is known for that $182,000 fine. So that was in November 2020. But let's talk about what's actually happening today. Mary and Tom, would you mind sharing with us what some of the threats are that we're presently seeing in the industry?
Absolutely. So at the department, we tend to categorize drone threats into kind of three big buckets. Careless and clueless, as Mark mentioned, non-attack or ISR, or basically surveillance drones. And third, attack drones, which would be your, dropping having a drop mechanism, maybe dropping some sort of explosive or, some sort of kinetic thing, even, with Wi-Fi enabled attacking somebody's network, things like that. So we have sort of those three buckets. Down at our southwest border especially, we're seeing a lot of very interesting things from transnational criminal organizations along the southwest border there. We're getting tens of thousands of drone incursions per day along our border. It's incredible the things that they're seeing, and it's really a glimpse into the evolving technology of drones. You can go on YouTube, you can see a lot of open source ways that Mexican cartels in particular have been utilizing drones. Again, just search Google or YouTube. They have drop mechanisms. They're very precise. They're able to hit rival cartels. They're able to transport very large amounts of fentanyl, other narcotics, and weapons across the border. Just imagine a drone coming across the border and dropping a payload of fentanyl at an elementary school or something like that in Texas. Like, the threat's already here. It's happening at the northern border as well. And we have cases of domestic events here in the States as well, where I think it's open source at this point. I won't go into specifics, but where a gentleman was using a drone to assault, his former ex-girlfriend by, dropping acid on her. So it's here, it's already here. And if we don't get ahead of it, emerging technology is something that we talk about a lot. We really have to keep our foot on the gas, learn from what we're seeing, and keep pushing for the authorities that we'll talk about later in the presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Someone mentioned the Pennsylvania fine, and then you mentioned the Pennsylvania. So there's another one in Pennsylvania with the substation. So I don't know what it is with Pennsylvania, but anyways. So something else with the threat is I think we have to be careful not to box ourselves in with what the threat is. One of the issues with 9/11 is that we've really failed to imagine what people can do if they really put their minds to it. And, Mary mentioned YouTube. When I was a bomb technician, I did a lot of IED awareness training and improvised explosives awareness training around the world. And we always talked about YouTube University. You can go on YouTube, they'll teach you how to make a lot of different improvised explosive mixtures. Some of them are self-correcting problems if you do them incorrectly. But the same thing goes with drones. There's a great market out there for building your own hobby drones. Anything that you want to do, you can build your aircraft, and you can, put your explosives together just by, seeing what you see on YouTube. So I think we have to really consider the fact that these drones are becoming more capable. They can be launched from both within and outside the United States. And so we need to think a little bit broader than what we are now. The drone technology is advancing very quickly.
What are your thoughts on airports and the risks that we're seeing around manned aviation? And can we talk about potentially the overall threat of what would happen, let's say, if a commercial airliner was hit with a drone?
Many of you know that I live my life on United. So let me tell you what the pilots are telling me. They are very concerned right now. And then part of the strike that's going on that you've heard about from American Airlines and Southwest, and then what United is doing sort of underneath the covers, if you will, is part of it you're going to see come out is that they're concerned when you get down to 1,000 feet in level under. I had a friend of mine just tell me that they just narrowly missed a drone. I happened to be at one of our bases in New Jersey. I won't name which one. I spent 3 weeks out there, and they are having serious issues with drones, and they're right next to the active runway. They actually have a federal penitentiary, which is very interestingly not very far off from a street. And then there's a public forest area where people run, and the drones are being launched from there, and they're extremely concerned. They don't even have any idea how many drones are being dropped the counterband on a daily basis, but that's not their biggest worry. Their biggest worry is right on the other side of the federal pen is the runway, and they do not have a way right now to protect their assets. And so until we can, this is real, and this is really serious. I got to express that to this room. I've got water districts, we've got utilities, we've got people, end user customers, telling us that they're worried. They're worried about our water supply. They're worried about what's flying over our industrial plants right now and taking pictures. They know monitoring's going on. They know they know that people are taking pictures of how many people are entering a production facility on a daily basis and leaving. And we have no clue what's going on.
So I had touched upon Philadelphia. I didn't think we were going to stay on topic. It's in that region. kind of makes me a little uncomfortable to be a local resident of the area. And my office is about 15 minutes away from Philadelphia. I was the counter drone consultant for the city when the press release came out about the $182,000 fine. So it was my job after the FAA had already defined what was going to happen to this problem to come up with a solution for the city. I wrote a 74-page document, and then the city took 10 months to redact it. So I know the problem exists and everything these guys are saying is true, but before we jump into solutions, let's fall back on data vulnerability and what that also does and how that compromises infrastructure and just everybody in general. It's not just airspace, it's also the integrity of major corporations that are trying to secure their information. Can any one of you guys talk about that?
I'll chat briefly about it. If you look, there's some recent news reporting of drones being used to carry some sort of a tool that can be used to gain access into networks or to trick people into thinking that they're signing on to their Wi-Fi, but they're signing on to something that's gathering all their information, and they get into the networks that way. So that kind of stuff is happening even from a non-physical threat standpoint. Corporate espionage is a big deal. Seeing what other companies are up to, competitors, getting into those networks are a big deal. So that's something we need to think about from that standpoint too.
Yeah, on that note, I had read an article as well about drones being equipped with, and I'm not a technical person, but drones being equipped with the capability to basically pick up cell phone signals, like pick up Wi-Fi. So, a bad actor can fly past a facility, maybe a chemical plant or something, and basically see anybody that has a cell phone or a smartwatch, they can see where those folks are. They can monitor that. They can see when, security guards have phones and smartwatches. They can see when the security guards move off their post and the new ones come in. So it's being utilized in that way too, to basically, case or investigate critical infrastructure in order to do something nefarious.
So now that we scared you, let's start talking about solutions. The ways that we can protect our industry and just kind of all team together to just make sure that the national airspace is safe. Lori's got hiding on her lap there something that I've been watching for quite a while. It's one of her new her projects. Why don't you talk about that, Lori?
I will. So this is what everybody's been asking me about. This is the brand new matrix-based radar, and it's also networked, and it also has the AI and machine learning. So it's all inside this box. This box weighs less than a pound. 3 of them makes up 360. And so you have a complete solution if you're on board, but it also does ground. So it's not just moving objects in the air, it's also looking at ground-based objects too. I think what is important to note is that the technology is here. We've been evolving technology, but we've been talking about all today about how do we start to move in the forwardness of the momentum. And I have to take a step and say, we cannot afford as a country to continue to rest on our laurels. Now, we have to support the FAA. You heard Abby this morning kick off. She's got the brand new ARC. And if we can support her through our constituents, through the different houses and the senators, we cannot afford to have that ARC sit on a 4-year timeline like what we've got right now with the BVLOS ARC. I happened to have been in Amsterdam speaking 3 weeks ago for Amsterdam Rome Week, or a month ago now. And I was with the head of Switzerland and she runs the entire equivalent of the FAA in Switzerland. And she turned to me before the panel kicked off and she said, and this is just so disheartening, guys. She looked at me and she goes, United States was always my leader, was always my shining star, was always the North Star that I looked to. She goes, you guys are really screwed up right now. And she goes, I can't look to you guys anymore. So she goes, I'm leading my own forum across Europe and what we're going to do in the European countries. But she goes, I have nothing to gain from the United States. And that was so disheartening because you have so much tech in this country and so many people that can bring something forward. And we have got to quit having these silos and we have to come together as a community and accelerate. testing after testing after testing is important, but there has to be an end to it so that we can propel. And even if it's in a given area that moves off of testing, but we have to unify and push this forward. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have the problems we just talked about. We're going to have some major things start to happen, and our intellectual property is going to go out the door. I'll get off.
Well, I think that's actually, before we jump into other solutions, it's an interesting transition point to bring Jonathan in. Before Jonathan talks, he is an attorney, so I don't want to, I guess anything you say here doesn't, it's not legal advice, I'm supposed to say. But what are your thoughts on just, the industry not moving forward the way it needs to, and as lawyers touched upon, basically how the law could get involved in challenging the FAA or just other organizations to move a little bit faster? I know you have some experience in that, and we'll touch upon it later, but how do you feel the industry needs to respond, or lawyers should be responding?
I think it's a great question. I think what would be very helpful is doing a very critical analysis of the legal issues at the very beginning, as opposed to trying to ram something through and then having problems on the back end. Because sometimes in the expediency of trying to do something, then what happens is there's the potential that there might be the unfortunate outcome of a ruling going the wrong way of some sort. So I think that was probably what would be very helpful, getting the attorneys involved at the very front end, and a lot of them, as opposed to on the back end.
Excellent point. I know we had talked about even rulemaking committees and everything like that, and all the comments that everybody's, puts in. At that point, is it too late, or should attorneys get involved sooner or start encouraging industry to influence the rulemaking before it even happens?
I mean, well, industry could probably file a petition for rulemaking under APA. I mean, there's the capability of doing that. So there's what the ARC's doing. Industry could potentially try to do something similar with their own APA, but that's a potential to split, cause a lot of trouble and stuff. So I don't know if that's the wisest. And at the same time, you're gonna have to coordinate that with potentially what government entities are presently doing now or what they want to do. So it's sometimes difficult when you're doing it on the outside, out of an arc. And if you were to try to run and do your own thing with the petition for rulemaking, separate from the FAA.
Gotcha. So let's circle back, since now we're not challenging the FAA and we're still thinking about solutions. Tom and Mary, would you mind sharing some of the other solutions that are available on the market, and just, which ones work, which ones don't?
That part I'm not going to get into. That one's throwing me down a pit. So there's basically there's basically four types of technology you can use to detect drones. You can use radars, cameras, acoustic sensors, and then radio frequency detection sensors. And then the radio frequency detection sensors can kind of fall into two categories in the US. Some of them don't violate federal statutes, and then there's some that do violate federal statutes, and that's something that is, I'm sure there's going to be some talk about legislation, but that's something that we're trying to move forward so that we can have a wide range of detection tools to be able to secure our critical infrastructure and our homeland. On the mitigation side, there's basically two main categories: is kinetic mitigation capabilities. And when I say mitigation, I'm talking about technologies that can disrupt, disable, or destroy a drone that's believed to be a credible threat to whatever you're protecting. So an example of a kinetic option could be a projectile, which could be a net. I got to watch a demo of a 30 millimeter cannon take down a drone in Fort Sill. That was pretty cool. Maybe not going to be applicable in downtown New York City. A collision drone, one that's meant to kind of collide into another drone and knock it down, a net capture drone, or using a net for a shotgun net or something like that could be an example of a kinetic. Or a rake. You smack that drone, you can smack it down. That's a kinetic option. Then there's non-kinetic options. Examples of that could include something like a jamming capability that is meant to disrupt the signal between the ground control station and the drone to cause it to crash, hover, land, raise up to get its signal back, or maybe return to home. Or you could have some sort of a cyber takeover technology that could take over the drone and basically give it a new home location and reroute it somewhere else. So there's lots of different examples of those types of things.
Yeah, just one thing to add. Apart from the technology piece of it, we call detect and respond is huge at countering drones. Just having the detection capability, sending a law enforcement unit out there to locate and educate the operator is huge. A lot of our drone flyers out there are careless and clueless. They didn't know that they couldn't fly over the stadium at that particular day. So just interacting and educating that operator and those operators in that whole community goes a long way in mitigating drones as well, in addition to the technological ways to mitigate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'll throw something in on that is being able to find and locate the pilot and then educate that pilot is huge. Probably when I was doing this mission, we had about an 80% success rate of finding and locating the operators and then educating them. And then we never saw them back again. Now, these were people that weren't a direct threat and it made sense to do that. But then kind of some of the more extreme cases, it was, where you might have to take other actions if they're available.
So when you're thinking of, the different classifications of errant operators, as we're talking about, you have careless, clueless, and criminal. The careless and clueless from the FAA safety team standpoint is people that we can educate and whatnot. But that education doesn't just go to the operator itself. It also falls over to law enforcement and the people who are actually going to use the technology. Mary, what policies and procedures is your agency putting in place to try to get these departments up and running?
So the current legal authority we have comes from the Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018, and Dawn has kindly linked all of these authorities in the references version, so you could, or the references on the website, so you can take a look at those. But Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018 is what gave DHS and DOJ the authority to conduct counter UAS. For the department, we have 4 components that are authorized to do counter UAS. It's United States Secret Service in protection of the POTUS and other VIPs, United States Coast Guard, Customs and Border Protection or just Border Patrol, and also Federal Protective Services, who they have the authority to protect federal facilities across the country. So our particular authority is 6 USC 124N, and I'm thinking about getting that tattooed somewhere because I say it about 4,000 times a day, so I'll just be like right here, 6 USC 124N. So that's the authorities that we currently operate under. So they're great. DHS has deployed over 500 times with no privacy issues and no negative impact to our national airspace. So I believe DHS has proven over 500 deployments that we can do this safely and we can do it judiciously. So there are a few gaps in authorities. I don't know if we're going to get into that right now, but 3 big gaps that I think we're going to address later in the conference. But just real quickly, critical infrastructures owners and operators need to be able to detect around their facilities. TSA needs the authority to proactively detect at airports and protect airports. And SLTT, our law enforcement partners that we heard from earlier today, law enforcement is tasked with protecting assets throughout their jurisdiction. Drones are just another threat. So why wouldn't we enable them to be able to counteract drones as well? So those are the 3 major gaps that we're working towards addressing.
So Dawn's going to be sharing reference material. I actually reference this pretty often. Just going to show it to you. It's a 2-page document. It's called Countering Unmanned Systems Legal Authorities. It's an excellent point of reference, as well as Tom's website on CUAS. So a lot of people are talking about remote ID and thinking that it's a solution for everything. Let's dive into that a little bit. It can get a little bit ugly. So thankfully, we'll be saving comments towards the end. But Tom, what are your thoughts on just, remote ID and the solutions that it may or may not provide?
Awesome. Thank you. So a couple disclaimers on remote ID. One, I'm a big proponent of remote ID. I hope that we have wide compliance when it's effective in September. It's going to be important for integrating drones in the national airspace and sets the stage for more complex operations down the road. From the security side, it provides law enforcement, federal agencies and such, the ability to find and locate pilots who may be violating, drone laws or might be flying in restricted airspace and such. So This point of view I'm going to give you is really more security related, and it may be different than what your use cases are. So just kind of take that with a grain of salt. So remote ID, there's basically three ways that you can comply with remote ID rule. You can fly a drone that's got the remote ID module or the broadcast module engineered into the drone as part of the drone. You can get is Aaron Pierce here?
He is here. He's just not.
Oh man, I was going to give him a plug. Let Aaron know I gave him a plug. He owes me a beer later. But another way is that you can, if you don't have a remote ID broadcast module as part of the design of your drone, you can attach a remote ID broadcast module to the drone, and it can broadcast that way. And the third way is to fly in an FAA recognized identification area, or FRIA, and you can comply that way. So from the law enforcement side, let's kind of take a look at it. Let's look at it if you receive remote ID broadcast message elements. From a security standpoint, if I receive broadcast message elements, all that's telling me is that a remote ID compliant or cooperative drone is flying within the vicinity of a remote ID receiver or sensor. That's really it for me, because one, I don't know what the intent of that pilot is. Someone could still be remote ID compliant, but they are up to some nefarious purpose. Maybe they have some other purpose in mind. They may not be complying with all parts of the remote ID rule or FAA rules. There's a lot of different things you can think of with that. It just doesn't tell you what the threat is. You can't really identify the threat from the remote ID broadcast. So it's really a data point, and you should be looking at there's a more holistic approach. That's where it's important for us to have a full range of detection authorities, camera, radar, acoustic, and full RF detection capabilities, so that you can do your threat assessment using your training policies, procedures, and such. Now, if you don't receive remote ID message elements, some people equate that to mean that they're not compliant with the remote ID rule, but you can't really make that determination directly from that. Now, if you're not receiving message elements, it could be that they're not compliant with the remote ID broadcast, with the remote ID rule. They might not be broadcasting message elements, and they're required to, and they're not. Or it could be they may have tampered with the hardware or software. They're trying to get around that requirement. But they could also be they could be one of the exceptions where they're not required to broadcast remote ID message elements. It may be a recreational only drone that weighs less than 250 grams or 0.55 pounds. They don't have to broadcast. It could be a law enforcement or other type of drone that may have some sort of an exemption. There could be RF interference in the area that might be impacting that broadcast from the drone or the reception of that drone by a receiver or sensor. There could be terrain, buildings, vegetation, any of those types of things that might inhibit it. So you have to take it from kind of a step back and really take a look at what that really means. And again, you don't know what the intent of the pilot may be. So it's just it's a data, one piece of data in a wider context of data that you need to have. And again, going back to the full range of detection authorities and kind of looking at it from that standpoint.
I have a question for Jonathan, actually, because we're talking about careless and clueless, but now if we're not compliant with remote ID, does that put us in the criminal category?
That's a great question. So potentially, I mean, you have to prove criminal intent, which might be problematic. Now, can you go after them civilly for non-compliance? And the FAA does that. That would be the lower hanging fruit from like a preponderance of the evidence kind of standard. But then the FAA is not really the most gung-ho when it comes to actually doing enforcement. Occasionally, they will do enforcement actions against individuals, such as that Philadelphia flyer for $182,000. But there are a lot of other individuals that they do not. So it is somewhat selective.
So can you touch briefly upon the FPV remote ID lawsuit, if you're allowed to talk about it, only because that's something that a lot of people already know about. So
I oral argued that case. Unfortunately, we did not win. Some of the issues that we raised, I think, are still outstanding, such as some of the Fourth Amendment issues. If you're flying in a backyard, the Caro case is still potentially very lethal. There are some issues there that weren't raised because the court really did not want to, I think, handle that Fourth Amendment issue, and they kind of kicked it down the road, arguing that we lacked standing because we didn't really kind of show causality. And it was interesting as am going now forward here, and I'm working on these criminal offense cases where the client was basically identified purely due to counter UAS equipment. It's interesting to see how some of the points that they, if you will, turned a blind eye to in the Race Day Quad's opinion are exactly what is coming to fruition in reality. So at some point, some of these issues will boil up to where if you throw enough charges at an individual, their only way out is to start making constitutional and statutory arguments to start trying to undo things. And that can potentially have a lot of wide range ramifications in some of the arguments we made in the Race Day Quads case, which were a lot of them were APA challenges to try to send it back for more tailored kind of rulemaking.
Okay. So I have a question for Lori next, because what I'm seeing quite often is the industry is trying to respond as technology is keep advancing. How do you feel Matrix Space is responding to remote ID?
Okay, from a standpoint of remote ID, we're working with partners. And when I meant earlier, I want to make very clear to the audience, it's a support to the FAA. It is not anything against, anything from the FAA to the FCC, all of this, we have to come together. And you just heard Mary talking about, from the standpoint of the Department of Homeland Security, we've done all this testing, all these activities. Let's come together, sit and say what else has to happen so that we can accelerate. Back to the question, what Matrix Space is doing, as well as a lot of the technology companies, is we are coming together as partners. No one company can cover every single little aspect. We have to bring the technology together in a holistic standpoint to be able to give it out to the end users and to support what we need to do. Now, what we haven't done really well up until now is, and I can say that because we really tried very hard. Our CEO is very adamant about open and being able to give information freely, share the data, share the information, is that we have to be able to interconnect cost effectively so that people can use our technology. It cannot be a closed system, because then it becomes what I like to call my favorite, an IT project for the next 5 years at $2 billion. So that's what we're trying to do right now from an industry, is changing that paradigm. So you can see some of the partners across in some of the different booths tomorrow, what we're trying to do to change and shift that.
So I have a question as far as remote ID cannot identify if someone if they're actually a threat or not. It's just providing a level of identification. And when you start pairing that with a counter UAS system, you're providing more information to the person who's looking at that feed. But what legalities and rules are out there for them to make that determination on, is that aircraft a threat, and how to move forward? Can anyone jump in on that one?
All right, so I'm not going to get too much into rules of engagement and some of the training that I received. I can tell you, I think it was Mary that mentioned, or someone, I think might have been Mary, that when it comes to training for counter UAS, you really have to have a wide variety of skills and abilities that you need to have. It's complicated in the homeland. You have to understand the legal side of things. You have to understand the airborne rules of the road. I'm hoping that if there is a future school, one of the things that we recommended when I was in service is that, if you want to come to the school, you got to be a Part 107 pilot. You got to kind of have some skin in the game, so to speak. And if you're not flying, hopefully you will start flying, because you need to be a Swiss Army knife for your team. You need to be able to set up networks. You need to be able to troubleshoot networks, troubleshoot systems, calibrate radars. Some of them are easier to calibrate than others. Set up the equipment, fly drones, test your systems, red team your systems. You got to train, people how to respond to the pilots. There's a lot of things that go into it. On the mitigation side of things, understanding drones and drone behavior is really important. If you don't understand, what's going to happen if you decide to mitigate that threat, you have no business pressing that button. And sometimes it's easier to train when to press that button, but it's even harder to learn when to not press that button, because sometimes you can, but you shouldn't. Doesn't if it's available, doesn't mean you should take it. So it's going to be very tricky for DHS and DOJ. I mean, I shouldn't say tricky. Coming up with left and right limits and some strong guidelines on how to perform this mission, in the homeland is going to take a little bit of work. But it's going to be important to set that standard for the state and locals. And as Mary said, DHS has been very successful with their missions. I can't comment too much about my previous employment, but we had similar success. We learned a lot of great lessons. And I think those two agencies together combining, and they've got a great working relationship with counter UAS. I think they're going to be able to come up with a good solution to eventually slowly integrate this technology into the state and locals.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And I wanted to mention too that each component or each agency mission is always slightly different. So what the Border Patrol may or may not do at the border is different than what the Secret Service may or may not do within the National Capital Region, is different than what FPS might do at a courthouse. So it really is dependent on that agency specific mission. And for example, Border Patrol, they may not mitigate a drone that they may choose to watch a drone that's making thousands of trips across the border just to kind of learn what are they doing and try to get a bigger picture of what's going on. And they've done that time and time again to try to make sort of a bigger case or maybe disrupt an entire drug ring instead of just one drone. So just because we can mitigate doesn't mean that we do all the time and doesn't necessarily mean that we need to.
So I like Tom's analogy about a Swiss Army knife, and we are at this Law Tech Connect event, so it makes sense for Jonathan to talk about the Swiss Army side of law here. We know that Congress is worried about the abuse of authorities. What are the limitations as it relates to the law side for counter UAS? In this case, Fourth, Fifth Amendment, wiretap, the pen tap, things like, and the FARs. Is there anything you could help us out in better understanding?
Well, yes, I can. I actually have an outline right here.
And you have 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. I'll do this. Okay, so government. So let's talk about limitations from a legal standpoint primarily. Government limitations, you have the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, wiretap, pin trap, also federal aviation regulations. Regarding Fourth Amendment specifically, Fourth Amendment deals specifically with people, houses, papers, and effects. And when you're dealing with drone operations, you're tracking people on the ground that are holding controllers, and then also you're potentially monitoring that drone as well as that individual in a house, which is a protected area, as well as the effect, which is the drone, the cell phone, or the controller. So each time you're looking at that, and this is how I look at it when I'm doing like an analysis, working on a case or something, like, hey, what are we actually dealing with? Where is this guy? What's going on here? You have multiple cases that are potentially in play here. You have the Katz, Carpenter, you have Riley, all sorts of different ones. And so you have to be very careful as to what you're monitoring, where you're monitoring, and if there's any data somewhere, how are you going about obtaining that data and properly obtaining it potentially with a warrant, especially if it's on a drone or on a cell phone that was used as a ground controller. So Fourth Amendment, that's a one big one right there from the government limitation side. From the detection kind of equipment analysis, you have pin trap, you also have wiretap. There's an interesting discussion there as to what is being transmitted and whether some of the information is pin trap or it is wiretap, and therefore electronic communications. And then are there any exceptions being used by law enforcement or by the public to potentially obtain that information? So that becomes a whole game in there. Can I receive this data? Is it lawful to actually receive this data? What is that data? Is it covered under pin trap or is it under wiretap? Additionally, you have laws on defeating drones. So you have, if you're maliciously or interfering with satellite government communications, you're going to be triggering multiple things under 18 USC section 1362, 1367. If you're actually attacking the aircraft, interfering with it, destroying it, you might trigger 18 USC section 32 or the anti-piracy, the hijacking one was at 49 USC 46502. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there. If you're hacking the drone, now you're getting into the computer, and then that creates problems because that's illegal also. You're starting to see this pattern here that a lot of the mitigations that you're kind of using as a way to deal with this are all illegal as for businesses, state, local, town, law enforcement. Pointing a laser pointer at an aircraft, that could potentially be, a problem as well. And so after you look at all that from the federal level, you also have a lot of states that came up with laws very similar. So you also have to deal with that as well. So, the federal law may say one thing, but then there's also whether or not that may be illegal under the state law as well. Because the federal, there's typically sets a minimum floor, but then the states can raise that floor to a higher level and have certain types of procedural requirements at the federal one. So there's some issues here when it comes to all these different types of laws. And
So now you guys can understand why I've personally hired John to represent my company. He's very thorough.
Well, so when I'm going through this and I'm starting to see when it comes to this analysis, I mean, from the federal limitations, those apply to the federal government as well as the state and local. Now, there have been some exemptions provided under these counter-U.S. related kind of acts, so it's allowing DHS, DOJ to do basically get out of these 18 U.S.C. Or these Title 49 related problems. But I mean, so setting aside the legal aspects to this, what's also kind of coming up here more and more as I'm dealing with these counter-U.S. related cases is just the practical problems that actually come about when actually trying to prosecute these things. So did actually anybody, and these are the questions I kind of go through when I start thinking out these, what actually went down. Did anybody actually ever see the drone do anything? It's kind of some data blips on your computer over there, but did anybody actually see the drone? So we're going purely off of the electronic data that you have. A lot of times when I'm seeing law enforcement is actually showing up to the site, the drone's actually shut down. It's in the car, it's in somebody's backpack, it potentially might be in somebody's home. Now you have a big problem because maybe you detected something, you saw something, but then how do you actually go about the stop is from the Fourth Amendment stop now becomes the big problem. And I mean, this one situation that I learned about, I was reading going through the discovery, it was pretty egregious where they're responding to the situation, the drone's landing in the yard, the people basically run into the house, and then the law enforcement's banging on the door. The lady comes to the door, says, get on the ground. And then at that point, they indicate that she consented to allow them to search the house. And I'm just like, guys, why didn't you get a warrant? You knew they went inside and that you were hunting these guys. So there's a lot of also just stop related issues, not even actually counter UAS. It's just this is just pure crim pro. Why didn't you just think this out?
So as you guys can see, there's this can be a minefield. And, not only is it something for the law side to have to work on, but, the manufacturers to try to find a solution to resolve people like myself who are answering questions of the industry to try to answer. And then, obviously, DHS and all the federal agencies to try to send the right information down to everybody else. So let's wrap up with just closing thoughts and just a quick 30 seconds on, if we had to leave everybody with something to summarize our discussion today, what would it be? Why don't we start with Mary at the end?
So you guys got them all flustered because countering UAS is difficult. So I'm gonna, my biggest lesson at policy is hard. It's really difficult to get a law passed in this country, but don't give up. We got to keep our foot on the gas. As everybody keeps saying, it's an olive community approach. We have to solve this as a community. Do not give up. Keep innovating. Keep your foot on the gas. We will keep pushing for legislation as well. And together as a group, I think that we'll get where we need to be.
Real quick for me, I know we talked heavily on technology. I'm a believer in technology, but that's not the only part of the solution. It's really sound policies and procedures. If you have technology, but you don't have good policies, procedures, and training, they really don't work very well. The other thing, too, when it comes to critical infrastructure, is technology will never be a silver bullet for us. So we have to start looking at ways that we can make physical changes to our critical infrastructure, how we build them, building resiliency into our critical infrastructure, whether it's the electrical grid or whatever. So those are some things we need to look at too from a wider perspective.
I kept thinking about it more and more, and I think the best way to sum it up is from watching how federal as well as the critical infrastructure, kind of petrochemical, everyone's trying to handle, trying to get the bad guy and stuff, just being critical of the Fourth Amendment issues on the back end. And so I would kind of sum this up as that 9 out of 10 doctors recommend a warrant. That's what I would say.
I want to give a counter to what was just said a second ago, and this comes from the oil and gas industry. So there is some emission requirements that happen if, particularly out in the Permian Basin, if anybody's out in Texas. And so what's been going on is we haven't been responsible as users, as drone operators in the industry. They are shooting over drones to try to find out if there's a flare. And when there is, they're reporting it to the FAA, or excuse me, to the EPA. Then what happens is the poor oil and gas industry has to report and say, oh, no, that wasn't a bad flare. This is the type of flare. This is what we were doing at the time. So we've got to be responsible as well in how we're interacting and supporting this. I mean, it's just not just the nefarious drones. It's people trying to do that because they get money for reporting this. And if it is really true, then they get some kickbacks and things like that. I shouldn't say kickbacks, that's not the right word, but they get some money, some dollars. So if I can leave with one thing, and that is let's move forward, but move forward together. And before I close, I do want to say one thing. I have to give a hats off to this conference. For those of you that were here last year, this room has tripled in size. Dawn and her team have worked around the clock to bring this together, and I don't know that we've really appropriately thanked Dawn.
So I think that's actually an awesome way for me to end this. I've been yelling from the rooftops that the industry needs to work together, and Dawn did it. She's got everybody in here, and it's really great to see. So with that, I'm just going to close. Thank everybody. It's a truly pleasure to meet and just be on the panel with each and every one of you. We'll open it up for questions, but we'll try to stay on schedule.
4 minutes. Probably got time for one. 3 minutes now.
Shoot.
I have a question, less on the national security front, but more on like the crime front, like we were talking about. And I guess this is more on like, I deal with a lot of state and local law enforcement and their issues because they don't have authorities that are prescribed to them by the Preventing Emerging Threats Act. They're like, how do we respond in a scenario when we do get a drone call? Is it that we have to log on to other crimes? Does the drone have to ram into somebody's house and make it a B&E? Does it have to hit somebody and be a battery or an assault? Are we allowed to take it out if that happens because there's an exigent circumstance and now there's public safety issues? So just wondering, what your perspective is on that. Is that a loophole for law enforcement to take a drone out of the sky? Or does that, now you've got federal laws like Piracy Act,
So, in regards to that, I've seen a lot of creative uses of it. I would say I'm very careful to not try to prescribe how I think something should be done because I think it's really interesting there. But I've seen a lot of law enforcement use careless and reckless endangerment is actually probably the most common one that my clients have actually been charged with under state law. But it actually becomes kind of problematic for them to actually get a successful conviction, because then if there's a drone in the sky and then there's the aircraft flying around, then the guy's able to figure out, okay, there's a vector and I got it. I got training at the academy. That goes nowhere. And then there's the drone's flying over people and somehow there's people there and there's drone there. So that's how I've seen it typically used. There have been some creative other uses. They would use charges that are typically aircraft agnostic so as to not open up issues regarding like preemption related counter challenges. So it'll be like, especially the drug related ones where they're trying to do introduction of contraband, right? It's a purely technologically kind of neutral one that doesn't raise a lot of issues. So careless and reckless and contraband introduction, those are the most common charges I see under a state law kind of scenario. I don't know if that answers your question. That's just what everyone else is doing. Maybe not what they're best to do.
I'm giving them the hook.
Yeah.
I'm giving the official hook. I know they could talk all day long. And so we've got a break right after this next panel, which, by the way, is on privacy and kind of relevant to what we're talking about right now as well. So grab them during the break. So thank you so much. Thank you, Dave.